Now we're at 5 minutes past 2, which I think is reasonable enough to give people 5 minutes to get here. So I think we should get started. So first of all, I want to welcome everyone very much to this educational on the Irish State and Revolution, based on a new book by James O'Toole. James is a long-time socialist activist, member of People Before Profit, and a member of the Red Network, and a contributor to Rebel Telly. And this is the first educational in a series of Saturday afternoon lectures, which will be taking place over the next few weeks. So this is the first one here today, based on the first chapter of James's book. So this is on the Irish Revolution and counter-revolution. So this is going to work in the way that James will be speaking for about 20 minutes. And then we'll open up to questions and answers and a discussion. And just to let people know that we are recording this session, we're recording the talk, but we won't be recording the Q&A session, so that people can feel comfortable asking questions and having a good discussion afterwards. So I'm going to give James about 20 minutes to speak, and then we'll open up for Q&A.
Yeah, so I suppose, I mean, in the last year, we've seen, from the rich people skipping the vaccine queue to Leo the leak, the Tánaiste, the leaking documents to his friends, giving them preferential treatment. Phil Hogan's arrogance when it came to Golfgate and his refusal to resign until there was a public uproar. But we've seen so many cases of corruption, and often people kind of question the nature of the Irish state. They're asking, why do we live in the kind of society we do live in? Why is there such a tight connection between the golden circle, the establishment in terms of the wealthy, the economic elite, and the political elite? And I think that those kind of connections occur in most countries, but I think the particular history of Ireland means we have a very tightly knit golden circle running this country. And I suppose what you've got to ask yourself when, if you've got a pet or an animal and the animal has scars, you could ask yourself, did some of those scars come about in the process of its development and growth, or were some of the scars there from birth? And I think the book goes chapter by chapter through the history and development of the Irish state, but I think we should look at the origin of the Irish state and explore some of the myths that the Irish state likes to say about itself in terms of drawing a continuity between 1916 and the state we have at present. And I want to argue that there wasn't continuity between people like Connolly, Pearse, and the aims of the Irish revolutionaries and the state we have at present. In fact, that between the years of 1918 and 23, the Irish War of Independence, or the Irish Revolution, if you want to call it that, during those years, there was actually a sharp rupture between the Irish, what was to become the Irish elite, and the Irish people. And I would actually argue that there was a counter-revolution, that there was actually an overturning of the People's Revolution. And that helped to establish the state that we have today. And some of its deformities, some of its scars belong to its birthing process. So actually uncovering the birthing process isn't just a historical endeavor, it's also about informing ourselves as to the nature of the state we live in today, which in turn then informs the type of strategies we adopt to change that state. Because if we understand the nature of the state, then certain strategies are ruled in and certain strategies are ruled out. So I want to start with two quotes. The first by obviously the socialist James Connolly. And he said, it's such a wonderful quote, he said, "When socialism is realized, every child in our Irish soil will be, by the mere fact of its existence, an heir to and a partner in all the country produces, just as easily as a citizen today has citizenship." In other words, imagine that, a society where by being born, by being a citizen, as easy as being born and being a citizen of a country, you should be entitled to a share of that country's wealth. You should be entitled to the right to housing, the right to healthcare, the right to a share in the wealth that the working class people of a country produce. We're the people who get the economy going, and Connolly saw it that, the fight for freedom should be attached to the fight for that kind of society. But there was a very different vision of Irish freedom in the minds of the Irish bosses. You know, the people who ran the factories, the people who were slum landlords, you know, who raised the tricolour and wanted the British gone, but they wanted to continue running the factories and they wanted to continue as slum landlords. They wanted to remove the Union Jack and put the tricolour over their slums and over their factories. P.J. O'Hegarty, a man who was part and parcel of the Cumann na Gael, the first Free State government, the first government after the Irish Revolution. This is a quote from him, and it kind of gives you a hint as to the attitude of the Irish rich at the time. "We have slain Frankenstein and buried him. The beast in us is restrained by the same sanctions and conventions which restrain men elsewhere." The Frankenstein that they're talking about is the Irish people. The people who had fought to remove the empire were then looked on as a problem. You know, we have to restrain these people with the same conventions, so they adopt the same laws and conventions that exist in Britain. They adopt the same kind of police force, the same kind of courts and prisons, the same kind of state, because we have to dismember and slay Frankenstein. And the Frankenstein is us. The Frankenstein is the mass struggles of the Irish people. So I just want to touch on some of the mass struggles that to show why a counter-revolution was necessary, and then to maybe explain why people like Connolly didn't come out on top and people like P.J. O'Hegarty, the kind of posh boys, came out on top and shaped the future of the Irish state. I mean, after the 1916 Rising, the kind of brutal repression that was meted out by the British establishment across Ireland, and particularly the execution of the leaders, saw, you know, popular opinion change. There was huge revulsion. So in 1918, you know, World War I is going on, and the British decide to introduce conscription. But actually, the response to the introduction of conscription was a massive general strike. On the 23rd of April, 1918, the entire country shut down. So you've got like tens of thousands of workers showing their power to shut the country down, which I suppose in a way sends a signal to the British Empire, but also sent a signal or woke something in the minds of people like P.J. O'Hegarty, who suddenly realized that there was a Frankenstein on the scene, that there was something big and powerful that could possibly shape the outcome of independence. You know, in the elections that later on that year, Sinn Féin got 70% of seats. But that Sinn Féin at that time was really a coalition as a nationalist party rather than being a socialist party. The Sinn Féin of that time had people like, you know, everyone from Arthur Griffith to, you know, people who saw themselves as more radical. It was kind of a coalition, a cross-class coalition. And it put national liberation to the fore and said, questions of land, food, and industry obscure our objective. In other words, you know, if you're a worker and you're fighting the British because you think it might improve your situation in terms of poverty or housing, put poverty and housing on the back foot. Labour must wait. First, we secure independence and then we answer those questions. And 100 years later, we're still waiting for the question of poverty, food, housing, and those kind of things to be answered. So the idea that the working class should wait before it raises its demands didn't really work out. But in 1918, building workers went on strike, a massive strike in Dublin. There was railway strikes, not only economic strikes for wages, but the railway workers went on strike because they insisted that they wouldn't ship British munitions. So you got to ask yourself, in the film The Wind That Shakes the Barley, when a British soldier put a gun to a train worker's head, it's not just about individual bravery that explains why the train worker could stand up to him, and the fact that the British officer didn't pull the trigger. It's also because of that context of struggle, that if the British officer shot a train worker, none of their munitions would be shipped in the following weeks. And so the British officer's hand was constrained by the power of the mass struggle, which is often written out of Irish history. In April 1919, and I don't have time to go into this in huge detail, but in April 1919, the high point of the struggle was what's called the Limerick Soviet. Robert Byrne was shot by the British. He was a freedom fighter. And basically the workers of Limerick took over the running of Limerick town for 2 months. They seized Canadian grain that was in the port. They printed their own money and used the value of the grain to basically say this money is worth something because we've got a load of grain in store, so that, gives the money some value. They set up a table every morning, gave workers a ticket so that people would get their bread. And it gave you a little tiny glimpse of what the working class was capable of. And, that this kind of a society that saw the fight for freedom, that the fight for freedom could be connected to the fight against inequality, and that workers could be in the driving seat. But the union leaders, people like William O'Brien, who would go on to be one of the founders of the Labour Party, they didn't want to give expression to this militancy, and they argued for the strike to end, which led to huge demoralisation. It's almost like the closer you push towards achieving your aims and then to have them snatched from you, the more demoralised people get, and actually the political context can shift then to the right. I mean, this is best illustrated by the Belfast General Strike of 1919. Again, you could do a whole talk just on the Belfast General Strike of 1919. 60,000 workers out. The mainly Protestant workforce elected a Catholic as the head of the strike committee because of his politics, because they believed he represented their class interests. So class interests can trump sectarianism. If someone is truly seen to, be representing a better life for Protestant workers. And the Belfast General Strike basically took the running of Belfast. But again, the strike committee had a lot of people who were kind of, union bureaucrats, union leaders who didn't see the strike as a means to a better society or a socialist society. They saw the strike only in terms of the immediate demand for, the demand for wages and demand for better treatment for workers. But actually, by not pushing further, the demoralization that ensued when the strike failed to push further led to then loyalist workers throwing Catholic workers and Protestant socialists out of the shipyards. So the revenge was taken not only on Catholics, but also was taken on Protestant militants. And actually the influence of socialist politics over Protestant workers was diminished by not pushing forward, by not continuing the struggle. Again, in 1920 and 21, the occupation of workplaces continued. There was occupation of creameries, like the Knocklon Creamery. Red flags flew over most towns. I mean, in 1920, there was a massive general strike in solidarity with hunger strikers in Mountjoy who'd gone on hunger strike. And during this night, the 1920 general strike, workers basically took over the running of most towns, Galway, Waterford. So the Irish elite, the people who owned the slums and the people who owned the factories, who wanted to get rid of the Union Jack, but replace it with the tricolour, you could see that they were very worried about the Frankenstein that they'd stirred up. They brought the Frankenstein of the Irish people to life in terms of all this mass struggle. How the hell do you put Frankenstein back in the box when you get rid of the British, was the question that they wanted to answer. And so if you think about that quote from P.G. O'Hegarty about dismembering Frankenstein, and think about partition. Partition, the division of the country, is often thought about in terms of the divide and conquer strategies of the British Empire, that if they could separate the workers who had gone on strike in Belfast and the workers who had gone on strike in Dublin, Galway, Waterford, obviously that weakens the working class. So partition is a means of dismembering Frankenstein, the Frankenstein of the Irish working class. But actually, if you think about it, partition also served the interests of our own elite who betrayed us, because they wanted to dismember Frankenstein too. They wanted to keep us down. They were like, right, we let you out of the box to help us beat the empire, but now we want to put you back in the box, and we'll use brutal means to put you back in the box. Because people like Connolly, Connolly had been killed in 1916, and Connolly didn't really leave an organization of people with the same kind of politics behind when he died. There wasn't a Connolly in Limerick to say the union leaders are betraying us, we should keep hold of the town and demand that the fight for freedom is linked to the fight for equality for working class people. There was no one to say that. And workers might have had it on the tip of their tongue, but sometimes, it's like the I'm Spartacus and then everybody stands up. Sometimes somebody needs to risk standing up first so that other people are inspired to stand up. We've seen that, it might be in a struggle over water meters, where someone in the community first defies, and then all the neighbours come out, and then suddenly everyone is empowered to fight back. There wasn't people with Connolly's point of view, embedded in struggle, both in Belfast, in Limerick, and all these different places that could do that. So in the end, the Irish Revolution started to become the Irish counter-revolution. It transitioned into a counter-revolution. William Cosgrave, the first leader, was from a family of wealthy Dublin vintners. These were very, very rich people. They were millionaires. Kevin O'Higgins, for example, his family were his family were kind of linked in to the Anglo-Irish elite. He called William Martin Murphy, you know, the infamous William Martin Murphy of independent newspapers, who battled Larkin and Connolly during the lockout. Kevin O'Higgins called William Martin Murphy his Uncle Willie. You know, these were his family members and friends. He owned shares in the Great Southern Railway. And when Kevin O'Higgins wrote his memoirs of the Civil War, he didn't write about the fact that he'd executed 77 people without trial. He wrote that the most tragic episode in the Civil War was the destruction of some railway lines. You know, these people, they cared about their wealth and their property, but they got to shape the Ireland to come. And so a massive defeat was inflicted on the Irish working class, because we went from, you know, controlling Belfast temporarily, controlling Limerick temporarily, controlling loads of towns during the April 1920 strike. The potential was there for the working class to put itself in the driving seat of the battle to remove the British Empire. So you would have had two simultaneous things going on: the removal of the empire and the fight for a more socialist, democratic, you know, worker-led society. So you would have had both at the same time, which was Connolly's vision. That was what Connolly wanted. But Connolly's tragedy was that there wasn't, 3,000 people with the same politics as James Connolly, who had the trust and were organically linked into their fellow workers. So it's in that context that we should understand, and we'll go into it more when I talk about the chapter on the church. It's in that context that we should understand the Magdalen laundries. You know, why was it that there were more children in prison in Ireland in the 1920s, in the early 20s? They were imprisoned in the whole of Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales. Well, think about it. How do you put Frankenstein back in the box? With a big stick. The church was used as a stick to beat us back into place. It's almost like, it's not because the Irish working class was weak, and it's not because the Irish working class didn't fight. It's because we did fight, but we didn't carry the fight through. And then we were punished, not by the British, who, still controlled the 6 counties, but in the 26 counties, we were punished by our own elite, who set up a state that was in every respect a replica of the British state. The first thing they did was they brought in a law called the Enactment of Acts, which basically meant that they could transcribe all the British laws over to being Irish laws. So laws like the 1848 poverty laws that were brought in to punish the Irish people during the famine were wholesale adopted as the laws that would govern this country. Even when they started to form the police, which we'll talk about next week, they adopted not the British model of metropolitan police forces that were answerable to policing bodies. They adopted the model of policing that Dublin Castle had employed, where the police force was answerable directly to a governmental power and not overseen by any kind of public oversight or public body. So they didn't even imitate the British laws that governed Britain, which are about, defending inequality and the British aristocracy and all that. They brought in the British laws that the British had brought in to keep the Irish people down. Our elite, reproduced those laws. And so, obviously after this massive defeat, people turned away from politics. And it often happens, like people go, why are people apathetic? Well, how come when someone like Bernie Sanders comes along or someone like Corbyn comes along, people suddenly get interested in politics and apathy seems to dissipate? If you make people believe that they're going to get something out of politics, they become interested in politics. If politics betrays people, they turn away from politics. So apathy isn't because people are stupid or they don't vote because they don't understand. Apathy is often a product of the fact that working class people have understood something about politics and the fact that parliamentary politics often betrays people. 43% of people voted in 1923 and 48.8%, almost 50% of people abstained from the 1924 election. So the ruling class just weren't challenged. The elite parties got in, from middle class and upper class votes, because a lot of working class people just didn't, and rural workers, farmers, poor people in the rural areas, they just didn't vote. They just gave up. They knew that the state that was being constructed wasn't in their interests. The Free State cleared the occupied factories. They shot over the heads of striking workers. They, arrested the members of Cumann na Bán, the brave women who'd, fought side by side with people like Connolly. And they collected dues and rents. Some of the first laws they enacted were about the collection of dues. And it was noted at the time by the British newspapers that the Irish government was collecting rent and dues with more enthusiasm than the Black and Tans and the British had collected unpaid debts, rent and dues from the Irish people. So that's the state we ended up with. Now, we'll go into the church and stuff like that and the connection between De Valera and McQuaid, but Fianna Fáil, because they'd fought on the other side against the treaty, had a radical aura. But Fianna Fáil didn't want a socialist Ireland. I mean, the kind of fallout between Cumann na Gael, who would eventually join with the Blue Shirts to become Fine Gael, and Fianna Fáil wasn't really a division between rich and poor or working class and upper class. Fianna Fáil wanted an Ireland that would have an economy that was built up behind protective tariffs. In other words, they advocated a particular strategy for building up Irish capitalism. They weren't going to challenge the capitalists. They offered a particular strategy for building up capitalism. Whereas Fine Gael, being tied, and Cumann na Gael before them, being tied to the big farmers, the big wealthy farmers, they wanted to keep trade relations with Britain open. And so in the end, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the division between them was a division in elite strategies rather than a division, between working class and upper class and stuff like that. So in the end, Fianna Fáil promised a lot. They were able to steal the Labour Party's thunder, because you think the Irish Labour Party, being born in the midst of revolution, would be one of the biggest Labour parties and most powerful Labour parties in the world. But Jim Larkin returned from America in the early 1920s and said, what does the Labour Party stand for? The Irish Labour Party, he said, it's a weak, pale, neglected thing that just is waiting to take up a role as a tame opposition in a British-style parliament. The Irish Labour Party wasn't interested in the mass struggles on the streets. They were waiting to take their turn as a loyal opposition in a tame opposition in a British-style parliament. They were looking at Britain as a model, in terms of tame parliamentary politics, instead of understanding that the mass struggles on the streets were the way to bring about change. And so, in the end, the Irish state was constructed by first people like William Cosgrave and then Kevin O'Higgins, and then later, and this will be my final, I'll just wind up now, it's like De Valera and Fianna Fáil came to power in 1932, and they promised a lot of change. I mean, in the election campaign, they talked about wages and poverty. They talked about issues like housing that were of concern to working class people, and they stole the Labour Party's clothes. And the Labour Party let them steal their clothes, even though Fianna Fáil were an elite party. The Labour Party was too weak to challenge them. They let them steal their clothes. But De Valera, once in power, he did build housing estates, but he enriched people like Cement Roadstone by doing it. In other words, he set up a lot of his cronies to make a hell of a lot of money from the Irish state by doing so. But by building housing estates, he was able to buy off the working class. And then whenever people complained about unemployment, he was able to point to the legacy of imperialism and blame the British. So Fianna Fáil actually were able to build a working class base, not because they tricked people or people were stupid, but because of a number of reasons, including they built houses, they stole the Labour Party's clothes, and the Labour Party were too weak to say Fianna Fáil are an upper class party that are stealing our clothes, and they used nationalist rhetoric. They gave out about the legacy of imperialism, which is obviously, there is some truth to the fact that Ireland was impoverished because of the legacy of imperialism. But De Valera used it to cover up the fact that his party were a party of the elite. And so De Valera and McQuaid sat down in the late 1930s to write the Irish Constitution. And it was a constitution that whole passages were written by the Catholic Church. And McQuaid was a man who thought socialism was the work of the devil. He thought trade unionism was a work of the devil. And the whole thing was framed in terms of keeping the Irish people down and keeping the Irish people quiet. So the 1937 Constitution, I think, has to be understood as the pinnacle of this counter-revolution that took place in the 20s and 30s. And I think that considering that, you know, it took a counter-revolution, it took Magdalen laundries, a corrupt police force, it took, you know, the brutalization of, you know, working class women and children in Ireland, you know, all the abuse scandals, everything that we saw in the 1920s and 30s, which continued in the decades subsequently, but it was at its most intense in the 20s and 30s. That was about, as they put it themselves, dismembering and restraining Frankenstein, the Frankenstein of the Irish people. And if it takes a counter-revolution to overturn a people's revolution, at what point was the Irish state overturned by a revolution? I mean, unless I'm mistaken, there hasn't been a revolution since. And so we're still living under the same laws, we're still living under the same state. Apart from the repeal of the Eighth Amendment and some insertions into the Constitution, aren't we still living under the same Constitution that was written by De Valera and McQuaid, which crowned the counter-revolution and the restraint of the Irish people, the necessity of keeping the Irish people down and keeping the wealth in the hands of the Golden Circle? So it seems to me that that should inform our strategies going forward, that if the aim of the left is to run this machine, this counter-revolutionary machine that was established to keep the Irish working class people down, then surely we're not overturning the counter-revolution. We're not untying the hands of Frankenstein and liberating the Irish people from the restraints that were put on them in the 1920s and 30s. I think that real liberation has to be about undoing what was done to the Frankenstein of the Irish people. In other words, undoing partition, undoing the laws that protect the Golden Circle at the expense of the people. And I think that that will require a massive people power. That will require the type of people power that we saw the Irish people, our grandparents and great-grandparents undertake in Belfast, in Limerick, you know, the Limerick Soviet, the Belfast General Strike. Those mass struggles are possible. And we saw that, a taste of it, a small taste of it with the water movement, where we saw hundreds of thousands out on the streets on over a dozen occasions. We saw people of all ages out in their communities linking arms to stop the installation of water meters. And actually, just as much as when a strike, like a massive general strike, goes up and doesn't reach its aims and then falls back, there's a period of demoralization. I think after the collapse of the water movement in 2016, there was a little bit of frustration and demoralization in working class areas. But these things never last that long. The cycle of struggle always returns. And I think that when it comes to paying the COVID bill, the elite in Ireland will use the state that was built in the 20s and 30s to try and take the money from our pockets. And we need to encourage people to rebel against that state.
Thank you very much, James, for that. There's a lot in that talk there. So